In this installment of Geography Tourism Studies 2P21, Introduction to Research Design, we will discuss the research proposal assignment. This is Jeff Boggs, and let's get to the fun stuff. For 2P21, your final assignment is to write a research proposal. The entire course has been geared to bring you to this culminating exercise. This research proposal should be 8 to 10 pages long in addition to a cover sheet. And this also does not include your appendix, which we'll talk about in a moment. It should include a research question that is related to Peterborough or the surrounding area. Should identify a site that is either in or near the city of Peterborough or in or near the county of Peterborough. You will describe how you will collect and analyze primary data. So remember, primary data are data that you collect yourself. And you have the option to then expand upon this proposal for your third year Peterborough field course. That's an option. So if you decide after writing this proposal that you want to do something else for your Peterborough field course next year, you're perfectly free to do that as well. Let's review what is included in a research proposal. This is a systematic 5-part plan for conducting research to answer your research question. It will include an introduction, which you should write last so that it actually matches the contents of what you've written. It should include a literature review, which will be a reduced, a condensed version of your literature review assignment. And if you so desire, can completely revise your literature review. You can add new material to it, or you can just condense what you already have. It will include a methodology, or we can also call this a research methodology, which is the plan within a plan. This tells us how you are going to collect data to answer your research question and how you are going to analyze that data to answer your research question. It will include appendices, and in your case, your appendix, so appendices is plural, appendix with an IX instead of a CES is singular, and your appendix is going to contain either a data collection sheet if you are using detached observation. So if you are a physical geographer, you'll probably include a detached, you'll probably use detached observation, and you will include a data sheet that identifies what measurements you'll be collecting for each of your observations, whether those observations are soil samples or 1 meter by 1 meter plots, or points along a transect. However, it might also be, and this is more common among tourism studies students and human geographers, that your appendix will either be a survey questionnaire or an interview guide, though it is actually possible to use detached observation as well for tourism studies and for human geography projects. The fifth component is your old friend, the bibliography or references or works cited or whatever you want to call it. And I implore you to look over your bibliography to see if there were any comments made on it. about it being inconsistently formatted. And just to be clear, the purpose of 2P21 is to learn to write a usable and doable research proposal. I suppose to be usable, it has to be doable, so maybe that's redundant. But in any case, the whole purpose of this course was to learn about how to write a research proposal. If we think really pragmatically. What goes in each part of the research proposal, you might ask? Well, I recommend that you read the written instructions and the rubric for more details that I won't necessarily cover here, but we can briefly cover the main parts, and then in a separate video, I cover common problems that I've seen in the last 2 years that I've taught 2P21, and common problems related in particular to the research proposal. So you'll want to view that movie as well, or film or video, whatever you want to call it. Your introduction, which you should write last, or at least seriously revise it if you write it first. And because a big problem with introductions is that people write introductions and then they write the rest of the paper, and then the introduction describes a different paper than the one they actually wrote. So you want to make sure that your introduction introduces the reader to the paper that you've actually written, or in this case, the research proposal you have actually written, and not the one that you intended to write. Your introduction should only be 1 or 2 paragraphs. It's going to state your research topic, which, remember, for Spickard is a more general research, is a bigger question, and then your specific research question that was used to guide your lit review. You're going to briefly describe your methodology. You're going to explain the importance of why this research is important, so that the reader doesn't ask themselves partway through, why do we care? So you want your reader to have a sense of, why should we care about this research? Why is it important? And often that involves, making clear what your research question is, but also drawing out the kind of practical implications of being able to answer your research question. Following your introduction will be the literature review, or the lit review, if you like to contract it. This establishes the context for your research. So even though you will probably only have, 8 and perhaps a couple of more sources than that, this helps, your literature review helps establish what is already known about your research topic and your research question. And it is still organized around themes because it is a review and not an annotated bibliography. So there's some synthesis that takes place. And hopefully you've written it in such a way that the themes that you talk about are the themes that are then explored in your research question and your methodology. So your themes, they reveal what you already know about the research topic or the research question. And this lit review component should only be maximum of 2 pages. So this usually involves people condensing what they've already written to make it a bit more compact and succinct. The largest chunk, the largest piece of your research proposal will be the research methodology. In this, you're going to state and possibly refine your research question. And so this may or may not be the research question that was used to guide your lit review. You're going to identify and justify the logical structure. So remember, Spickard uses or Spickard identifies 10 different logical structures. You'll want to determine which of those 10 is the one that you're going to use to structure how you answer your research question. You're going to then identify and justify the type of data that you will be collecting. Remember, you want to collect primary data, and Spickard in his types of data identifies about 14 types. Again, if you're a physical geographer, it's likely that you will be relying on acts, behaviors, or events, and with the events being the operative word unless you're looking at animals, in which that case it might be acts or behaviors. You will then identify and justify your data collection method, including sampling. Again, if you're a physical geographer, Spickard's scheme works out such that your data collection method is detached observation. For sampling, remember, Spickard talks a lot about site and sampling, and for your sampling, you are going to be in the location where you have to collect the data. So bear that in mind. So when you're describing the site, it's the site where your data is actually found. So if you are looking at tree growth and how it varies with distance from a stream or a road or something else, then your site is going to be, a location along a particular stream or particular streams, or along a particular road or roads, if that were your question. And then with regards to sampling, you want to talk about, are you making use of random sampling, which you really only need to do if you are making generalizations from that sample about a larger population, and it has to be random sampling. And if it's random sampling, you need to identify your sampling frame and your procedure for figuring out, I guess, for conducting the randomization process. So, is it, you pull numbers out of a hat the old-fashioned way, or some other procedure? And likewise, you want to think about somewhere in here your unit of analysis and your unit of observation, right? And so this is the point where it's good to know what is your unit of observation. That's the sort of, are you sampling from particular trees? Are you providing surveys to a non-random sample of passersby in a tourist district? But you want to be clear about whatever that is. You want to identify and justify your data collection site. This involves explaining, where the site is, or, one of a couple of sites, which actually means that you need to think a bit about Peterborough and the surrounding environment. And your justification should include something that talks about how you link your population to your sample. Even if you're not engaged in random sampling, you want to still think about, this sample is drawn from, this group of trees or people or dogs or sidewalks or whatever it is that you're sampling, whatever it is your unit of observation is. You want to think about why that makes sense as the site for collecting your data to answer your research question. Sometimes that's more obvious than other times. So you then want to identify and justify your data analysis method, including the kinds of patterns that you think that you might find based on your lit review and or your intuition or sort of assumptions about what might be happening. And at the end of the methodology, you'll provide a little table with a timeline. And I'll have another slide about that in a moment. Your methodology should be 2 to 4 pages long. I've seen really good ones that were 2 pages long, and I've seen really good ones that were 4 pages long. I've also seen really bad ones that were 2 pages long and really bad ones that were 4 pages long. If it were 5 pages, that might also be okay as long as you are providing detail and it's not that you're just wordy and that you needed to edit what you're writing. I will provide you 2 examples of timelines. So here is a timeline that is designed for a research question that will be answered using interview data. So it is a qualitative research project. And the points, or I guess the columns that we have here are, when, so roughly a time. So it's fine to use contractions. So in September, because you remember the second week of October, so Thanksgiving week, this week right here, is when, so this week right here, this is when you will be in Peterborough collecting data, and you have 3 days to collect your data, not 4, you have 3 days. Because the first day you get there, I don't think you go into Peterborough. Instead, you get acclimated to your new surroundings. Anyway, Thanksgiving week is the time that you'll collect your data. But before you collect your data, you will probably need to do some preparation for field work. So data collection, it happens in the field. Another name for this is field work. So preparation for field work. So tasks in this instance are, develop and test an interview guide, complete an ethics application. So we didn't cover ethics, but if you are going to interview or survey people, then you will need to complete an ethics application that will be vetted by the instructor of 3P56 or 3P57. Physical geographers generally avoid this step because the instructor has usually negotiated access, will have negotiated access to the land that you'll already be making use of. But let's focus on this one. So in this case, if you're going to have an interview guide, that implies that there's some people, some kinds of people that you would like to interview. And so you'll identify your potential interview subjects. This is going to, you're going to have to think about who's the population that I want to interview. How will I select people for that? And you'll contact some number Y, I just put Y in there as a variable. So some number of interview subjects. And then you'll also schedule those interviews for the ones that say yes, because not all of them will want to be interviewed. The ones that say yes, then you will schedule a time for the week of Thanksgiving during normal business hours. But for your timeline, this is really what you would need, something like this. The first week of October, that's the week right before Thanksgiving weekend. So then you want to contact and confirm with your Z interviewees. So the people that said that they would interview, you want to contact them and make sure that they remember that next week you're supposed to interview them so that you don't show up with a big surprise. And actually, even in the field nowadays, most people have cell phones or smartphones. You could even call them again the day before to confirm the interview. And you might also then want to map the route so that you know where you have to find these people when you are in this case, probably Peterborough. During Thanksgiving week, you then will collect your data, so you'll conduct your interviews, and you will, to the best of your ability, write up your interview notes. Remember, those are different than transcriptions. After you leave Peterborough and you come back, so for the rest of October and November, you might then engage in data cleaning and analysis, or maybe you'd even be done by the end of October, depends on how fast you are. So you'll transcribe your interviews, you'll code your transcriptions, you'll analyze your codes, because you're looking again for patterns in your data. And then you want to see if these patterns might be consistent with what you thought you would find or what the literature suggests you would find or not. And then you want to think about what that means for your research question. So what kind of answer does it provide for your research question? And your answer should probably not be yes or no, especially for qualitative research. But even for quantitative research, yes or no answers to a research question are kind of boring. The last phase then involves writing. So in December, on this one, I have writing starting, but maybe it actually start in November. So, you write up your findings, and you might even then circulate your findings to your interviewees if you told them that you would do that. You want to make sure that you anonymize the documentation or whatever you provide them. You don't want people to easily identify. So you want to, if you promised with interviews, you can't really be anonymous. You have to promise confidentiality. So maybe to maintain confidentiality, you might even decide that you're not going to circulate your findings to your interviewees. So if you didn't promise this to your interviewees, then you may not want to do that at all. If you promised it to them, then you just want to be careful that no one can use your findings to cause harm to another person, be that physical, which is unlikely, or financial or career, which might be more likely. So it just depends on who you're interviewing. Okay, so this was an example using an interview guide for qualitative research. For survey, it would be a little bit different, but you get kind of the gist of it. But let's go to a timeline for a physical geography. Here is a timeline for a physical geography project. The research question for this project would be something along the lines of, what is the geography of lead pollution due to automobile emissions alongside roads? So nowadays, and for a few decades, probably actually closer to maybe 4 decades, unleaded gasoline has been the norm. But before that, leaded gasoline was used because it had better performance properties. It prevented engines from knocking and things that are like, it was used for reasons that seemed good at the time. But then once people realized lead has some problems associated with it as a pollutant, then lead was taken out of gasoline, largely because automobile emissions contained, particulate matter that included lead, and as that accumulated, it could harm people and other parts of the environment. Anyway, in this case, for this, you would want to identify suitable roads and shoulders, probably by looking at maps. And you would want to identify roads that had been built before unleaded gasoline became the norm, because you wouldn't expect very much automobile emissions to produce, well, basically unleaded gasoline should not have lead in it, and should not, cause lead pollution. So you want to find a road that was driven on when people still used leaded gasoline for this particular project. So you probably would refer to some maps, older maps. And you'd also want to figure out when exactly was unleaded gasoline introduced and when was leaded gasoline outlawed. You then want to also think about what soil sample test you would need to run to identify lead, and are there other things you would like to measure in addition to lead levels in the soil. You'd want to determine the minimum and maximum number of samples that you need. You want to probably practice measuring transects, because I would imagine that in this case, if you're interested in the geography of lead poisoning along roads, or lead pollution, lead contamination along roads, that I can imagine, though you'd want to do a lit review to check this, that locations adjacent to roads, so the shoulders, would be areas with the highest level of lead contamination, and this would probably drop off as you moved away. The way you would capture that distance decay, so as you move away from the road, the levels of lead should decline. I suppose we can think of that as a hypothesis. You might say, okay, I'm going to take a 30-meter transect, and every 3 meters, I'm going to take a soil sample. So you start at 0 meters, go out to 30 meters, so 0, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24, 27, and 30. I think that gives you 10 samples per transect, and it allows you to capture, whether or not lead levels tend to decline as you move away from the road. And you probably would do this in a couple of different places. So you'd have a transect in a, maybe, a transect, every 100 meters or 500 meters or something like that. So a 30-meter transect, along the same road. And so you'd want to identify the location where you probably would collect these samples, and you'd want to practice collecting samples just to make sure that you know what you're doing when you get out in the field. And you would want to practice measuring your transects. In the week of just before going to Peterborough, so remember, Thanksgiving week, you leave on a Tuesday morning, and you then take a bus to Peterborough with all the other students. And that, so before that, you want to plan for emergencies. So collect rain gear. You might review and prioritize possible sites. It's possible that the maps you were looking at, don't show the new building that covers up 2 of your transect spots. So you want to have some backup plans. Then during the week of Thanksgiving, when you're in Peterborough, you'll actually collect your data. So you might assess the sites. You probably are going to take photos of the sites. You might sketch out, the general kind of vegetation patterns. You might even take a photo of the location where you collect each of the samples along the transect. You'll lay your transect lines. You'll collect your soil samples, probably get your GPS coordinates. You'll record your notes about the site and the samples. And remember, you'll have different sites because each transect kind of corresponds to a site. And then you'll come back from Peterborough in October to November. You'll, clean your data, and you'll analyze it. So you'll prepare your soil for analysis. You'll analyze your soil. This probably usually takes longer than you might expect it to. And then by December, maybe before then even, you'll start writing up your findings. So that was an example of what it might look like, what a timeline might look like for a physical geographer. Your appendix will then include one of a data collection sheet, an interview guide, or a survey questionnaire. So for your data collection sheet, you want to think about, if you're a physical geographer, what kind of data have you had to collect in your physical geography labs or your earth science labs or your biology labs? And that, in the sheet that you collected those data on. So that is what I'm thinking of. We've already covered interview guides and survey questionnaires. So in rare cases, you might also include a map, to say, oh, well, this is where I think the transects would be, but honestly, you don't need a map for this. Like, if you want to include one, that's totally awesome. That's fine. Just make sure that you give it a title and you actually refer to it in the body of your proposal. And you'll want to refer to your data collection sheet, interview guide, or survey questionnaire in the body of your proposal as well, so that the reader actually knows that it exists. Maybe you'll have a diagram. That also is not very common, and I don't expect that, but if you had one, you could stick it in there as well if it doesn't belong somewhere else. This appendix should be really 2 pages maximum. And before I talk about the bibliography, I just want to remind you that the appendix, the thing that we just talked about, that does not count against your page limit. Your appendix does not count against your page limit. Your bibliography, this includes the bibliographical information for all the sources that you used in your research proposal. If you didn't use that material, don't include it. Also, check your annotated bibliography and your literature review to see if you lost marks for inconsistent formatting or missing information. A lot of people did. So make sure that you actually have all the page numbers, that if you've italicized the journal titles, that you've italicized all of the journal titles. If you, include issue numbers, if there wasn't a DOI, then say that no DOI is available. But be consistent. And find the missing information. Often that's page numbers. The point here is that if you did not use it, do not include it in your bibliography. That concludes the overview of the instructions for this assignment. Be sure to see the next video that talks about common problems associated with each phase or each section of the research proposal. See you later.